The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, yet both knew they would have to. Henry Bailey's breath caught as he watched Ryan Ross's face transform, the careful mask of friendship finally slipping away to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. "I can't stop thinking about you," Ryan had just whispered, his voice breaking on the last word. "And most of those thoughts, they're about you in ways that terrify me." Henry's world tilted on its axis. The coffee shop around them seemed to fade into background noise, the clatter of cups and murmur of conversations becoming nothing more than white static. All he could see was Ryan's face, flushed and vulnerable, eyes wide with the fear of someone who had just stepped off a cliff without knowing if there would be solid ground below. This was the moment Henry had dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure for 2 years and 4 months. 2 years and 4 months of listening to Ryan complain about his girlfriend, of offering advice about relationships while his own heart twisted like a knife in his chest, of pretending that the electricity he felt every time their hands accidentally brushed was just his imagination. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two best friends found themselves sitting across from each other in a crowded coffee shop with the weight of unspoken love finally breaking the surface, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Henry had been doing what he always did on Thursday evenings, sitting on Ryan's couch pretending to watch whatever show was playing while actually watching Ryan himself. The way Ryan's dark hair fell across his forehead when he leaned forward, the unconscious way he bit his lower lip when he was thinking, the graceful movement of his hands as he gestured while talking about his day. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Ryan had been dating Susan Clark for 8 months by then, a relationship that seemed perfect on paper, but left Ryan increasingly restless and dissatisfied. Henry had become an unwilling expert on their problems, listening night after night as Ryan tried to articulate what was missing, what felt wrong, why he felt like he was playing a role in his own life. That particular Thursday, Ryan had been quieter than usual, staring at the television screen without really seeing it. Henry could feel the tension radiating from his friend's body, the way Ryan's shoulders were rigid with some unspoken stress. "What's going on?" Henry had asked, muting the television and turning to face Ryan fully. "You've been somewhere else all evening." Ryan had looked at him then, really looked at him, and Henry had felt that familiar flutter in his chest, the one he'd been trying to suppress for so long, it had become second nature. There was something different in Ryan's gaze that night, a searching quality that made Henry's breath catch. "Can I ask you something weird?" Ryan had said, his voice unusually hesitant. Henry had nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He would have said yes to anything Ryan asked, would have given him anything he wanted, and that knowledge sat heavy in his chest like a secret he could never share. "What does it feel like when you're really attracted to someone?" Ryan had asked, the words coming out in a rush. "Like not just thinking they're good looking, but really feeling it in your whole body." The question had hit Henry like a physical blow. He'd spent so many nights lying awake thinking about exactly that feeling. The way his entire nervous system seemed to light up whenever Ryan was near. The way his heart raced when Ryan smiled at him. The way he felt like he was drowning in the best possible way whenever they were alone together like this. "It feels like electricity," Henry had managed to say, his voice carefully neutral. "Like every nerve ending is suddenly awake. Like you can't quite catch your breath, but you don't want to." Ryan had nodded slowly, as if Henry's words were confirming something he'd suspected. "And what if you've never felt that way with someone you were supposed to feel it with?" Henry's heart had started beating so hard he was sure Ryan could hear it. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you're in a relationship with someone who's perfect on paper, someone who should make you feel all those things, but instead it just feels like you're going through the motions, like you're acting out a script someone else wrote for your life?" The pain in Ryan's voice had been unmistakable, and Henry had wanted nothing more than to reach across the space between them and pull Ryan into his arms. Instead, he gripped his hands together in his lap and tried to keep his voice steady. "Maybe it means you're with the wrong person," he'd said quietly. Ryan had been quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. "Or maybe it means I've been looking for the wrong things altogether." The conversation had ended there, Ryan suddenly claiming he was tired and needed to get some sleep. But something had shifted between them that night. Some invisible barrier had been cracked, if not broken entirely. Henry had gone home and lain awake until dawn, replaying every word, every glance, every moment of hesitation in Ryan's voice. Over the following weeks, their interactions had taken on a new quality of tension. Ryan had started showing up at Henry's apartment more frequently, often without calling first, always with some excuse about needing to get away from his place. Henry had never minded, had treasured every unexpected visit, but he'd begun to notice the way Ryan's eyes would linger on him sometimes, the way conversations would trail off into loaded silences. It was during one of these visits, about 2 weeks after their conversation about attraction, that Ryan had asked if he could stay the night. His apartment's being fumigated, he'd said, but Henry had seen through the excuse immediately. Ryan's building wasn't being fumigated. His relationship with Susan was just getting worse, and he was looking for any reason to avoid going home to her. Of course, Henry had said, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened at the thought of Ryan sleeping just down the hall. You can take the guest room, but when Henry had woken up in the middle of the night to get some water, he'd found Ryan sitting on his couch in the dark, still fully dressed, staring out the window at the city lights below. "Can't sleep," Ryan had said when he noticed Henry standing in the doorway. Henry had joined him on the couch, leaving careful space between them, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from Ryan's body. "Want to talk about it. I keep thinking about what you said," Ryan had admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "about being with the wrong person." Henry's mouth had gone dry. "Anne, and I think you might be right, but it's more than that. It's like I've been living someone else's life, making choices because they're what I'm supposed to want, not what I actually want." "What do you actually want?" Henry had asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Ryan had turned to look at him then, and in the dim light from the street lamps outside, Henry had seen something raw and uncertain in his friend's expression. "I don't know," Ryan had whispered. "That's the problem. I've spent so long doing what was expected that I'm not sure I know how to figure out what I actually feel anymore." They'd sat in silence after that, the weight of Ryan's confession settling between them like a living thing. Henry had wanted to reach out, to touch Ryan's hand or his shoulder, to offer some kind of comfort, but he'd been paralyzed by the fear of revealing too much, of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Eventually, Ryan had gone to the guest room, and Henry had returned to his own bed, but sleep had been impossible. He'd lain there listening to the sounds of Ryan moving around down the hall, the creak of the mattress as he settled in, the soft sigh that carried through the thin walls. Henry had pressed his face into his pillow and tried not to think about how much he wanted to go to Ryan, to hold him, to tell him that he didn't have to figure everything out alone. The next morning, Ryan had been gone before Henry woke up, leaving only a note thanking him for letting him stay. But something fundamental had changed between them. A door had been opened that neither of them seemed to know how to close. Their friendship had continued, but with an undercurrent of tension that grew stronger with each passing day. Ryan had started breaking up with Susan in slow motion, a process that involved long, agonizing conversations about their future and whether they were right for each other. Henry had listened to every detail, offering support and advice while dying a little inside each time Ryan described another attempt to make things work with her. It was torture, but it was also hope, because with each conversation, it became clearer that Ryan was questioning everything about his life, including assumptions about himself that he'd never examined before. The breakthrough had come 3 weeks ago during what had started as an ordinary evening at Ryan's apartment. Susan had been out of town visiting her sister, and Ryan had invited Henry over for dinner and a movie. They'd cooked together, something they'd done countless times before, but Henry had noticed the way Ryan kept finding excuses to brush against him, to reach around him for ingredients, to stand closer than was strictly necessary. After dinner, they'd settled on the couch to watch a movie, but neither of them had been paying much attention to the screen. The conversation had drifted to relationships again, as it so often did these days. But this time, Ryan had been more direct than usual. "Henry," Ryan had said during a particularly quiet moment in the film, "can I ask you something personal?" Henry's heart had started racing, but he'd nodded. "Have you ever been in love with someone you couldn't have?" The question had hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Henry hadn't dared to examine too closely. Yes, he'd said simply, because it was the truth and because he was tired of hiding it, even if he couldn't say who. What did that feel like, Ryan had asked, turning to face Henry fully. Like drowning, Henry had said, the words coming from some deep, honest place he rarely accessed. Like you're suffocating and flying at the same time. Like every moment with them is the best and worst moment of your life because you know it's all you'll ever have. Ryan had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Henry's face with an intensity that made Henry's skin feel like it was on fire. And if that person felt the same way, Ryan had asked, his voice barely audible, if they told you they'd been feeling the same thing, what would you do? Bo. Henry's breath had caught in his throat. I'd probably think I was dreaming, he'd managed to say. And if you weren't dreaming, then I'd tell them that I've been waiting for them to realize it too. They had stared at each other in the flickering light from the television, both of them breathing too fast, both of them balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Henry had seen the exact moment when Ryan made his decision, the way his expression shifted from uncertainty to something like resolve. Henry, Ryan had whispered, I think I need to tell you something. But before he could continue, the sound of a key in the lock had shattered the moment. Susan had come home early from her trip, tired and irritable, and the spell had been broken. Ryan had jumped up from the couch, putting distance between them, and Henry had felt the familiar ache of disappointment settle in his chest. The evening had ended awkwardly, with Susan complaining about her flight and Ryan making stilted conversation while avoiding Henry's eyes. Henry had left soon after, claiming he had an early morning, and had spent the next 3 weeks wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. But Ryan hadn't let him wonder for long. The text had come 2 days later, simple and direct. Can we talk? Coffee tomorrow. Henry had stared at the message for a full 5 minutes before responding. Of course. Which brought them to this moment, sitting across from each other in their usual coffee shop, the weight of unspoken words finally becoming too heavy to bear. Ryan had ordered his usual black coffee but hadn't touched it, his hands wrapped around the cup like he was trying to absorb its warmth. Henry had gotten a latte, but it had grown cold while he waited for Ryan to find the courage to speak. I broke up with Susan, Ryan had said finally, the words dropping between them like stones into still water. Henry had felt his heart skip a beat, but he'd kept his expression neutral. How are you feeling about that? Relieved, Ryan had admitted. Guilty about feeling relieved, but mostly just relieved. It wasn't fair to either of us to keep pretending. Pretending what? Henry had asked, even though he thought he knew the answer. That I was happy, that I was in love with her, that I wasn't thinking about someone else every time she kissed me. The confession had hit Henry like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands shake where they rested on the table. Someone else, he'd repeated, his voice carefully neutral despite the chaos in his chest. Ryan had looked up then, meeting Henry's eyes directly for the first time since they'd sat down. Someone I've been thinking about for longer than I want to admit. Someone who's been right in front of me this whole time, and I was too scared and too stupid to see it. Henry's world had started to tilt, reality shifting around him like a kaleidoscope finding a new pattern. Ryan, he'd started to say, but Ryan had held up a hand to stop him. Let me finish, Ryan had said, his voice shaking slightly. I need to say this before I lose my nerve. I've been lying to myself for years, Henry. Lying about what I wanted, about who I am, about what makes me happy. And the worst part is that the truth was always right there. In every conversation we've had, every time you've listened to me complain about my relationships, every moment we've spent together. Henry had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he'd blinked them back, afraid to believe what he was hearing. I can't stop thinking about you, Ryan had continued, his words gaining strength as he spoke. And most of those thoughts, they're about you in ways that terrify me, ways I never let myself think about anyone before. When I'm with you, I feel like I can finally breathe. When I'm not with you, it's like part of me is missing. And I know this changes everything between us. And I know I might be ruining the best friendship I've ever had, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying in their vulnerability. Henry had stared at Ryan's face, taking in the flush across his cheekbones, the way his hands trembled slightly, where they gripped his coffee cup, the hope and fear warring in his dark eyes. How long, Henry had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How long what? How long have you known? Ryan had let out a shaky laugh. Known is a strong word. I think part of me has always known, but I've been really good at not knowing, if that makes sense. But that night we talked about attraction, about what it feels like to really want someone. I couldn't stop thinking about your answer, about how perfectly it described the way I feel when I'm with you. Henry had felt his heart hammering against his ribs, so hard he was surprised it wasn't audible over the coffee shop's ambient noise. And when you asked me about being in love with someone you couldn't have, I was asking about you, Ryan had admitted. I was asking if you'd ever felt about me the way I was starting to realize I felt about you. Henry had closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Ryan was telling him. 2 years and 4 months of careful distance, of hidden feelings, of loving someone who he'd thought would never love him back. And now Ryan was sitting across from him, laying his heart bare, offering everything Henry had ever wanted but never dared to hope for. Henry, Ryan had said, his voice urgent now, please say something, even if it's to tell me I've misread everything, that you don't feel the same way. I need to know. Henry had opened his eyes, meeting Ryan's gaze directly. You haven't misread anything, he'd said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. I've been in love with you for 2 years and 4 months. Since that night you came over after your first fight with Susan and fell asleep on my couch. I woke up and found you there, and it hit me like a truck that I wanted to wake up and find you there every morning for the rest of my life. Ryan's breath had caught audibly, his eyes widening. 2 years, 2 years and 4 months, Henry had confirmed. 2 years and 4 months of listening to you talk about your relationships and wanting to tell you that you were looking for love in all the wrong places because the person who loved you most was sitting right next to you. 2 years and 4 months of pretending that the way I feel about you is normal, that everyone feels like their world might end if their best friend moves to another city or falls in love with someone else. Ryan had reached across the table then, his fingers finding Henry's and intertwining with them. Henry had felt that familiar electricity, but stronger now, amplified by the knowledge that Ryan felt it too, that this touch meant something different now than it ever had before. I'm sorry, Ryan had whispered. I'm so sorry it took me this long to figure it out. I'm sorry you had to watch me with other people when you were feeling this way. Henry had squeezed Ryan's fingers, marveling at how right it felt to hold his hand openly. Without pretense or excuse, you couldn't have known something you weren't ready to know, he'd said gently. And I chose not to tell you. I was too scared of losing you entirely. And now, Ryan had asked, his thumb brushing across Henry's knuckles in a gesture so tender it made Henry's chest ache. Now I'm terrified, Henry had admitted. I'm terrified that this is too good to be true, that you'll change your mind, that we'll ruin our friendship by trying to be something more. Ryan had been quiet for a moment, studying their joined hands. I'm scared too, he'd said finally. I'm scared because I've never felt this way about a man before, and I don't know what that means about me or my life or our future, but I'm more scared of not trying, of spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been. The coffee shop had continued its normal rhythm around them, other customers coming and going, the barista calling out orders, the soft jazz playing overhead. But Henry had felt like they were in a bubble, separate from the rest of the world, existing in this moment of perfect honesty and terrifying possibility. What do we do now? Henry had asked, the question that had been echoing in his mind since Ryan's first confession. I don't know, Ryan had said, and then he'd smiled, the first real smile Henry had seen from him all afternoon. But I'd like to figure it out with you, if you want to. Henry had felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. I want to, he'd said. I want to try this with you, whatever this is. Ryan had lifted their joined hands, pressing a soft kiss to Henry's knuckles that sent electricity shooting up Henry's arm. Can we get out of here? Ryan had asked. I want to talk more, but somewhere private. They'd left the coffee shop hand in hand, neither of them caring who might see or what anyone might think. The walk to Henry's apartment had been quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts, processing the magnitude of what had just happened between them. Once they were inside, away from the world and its expectations, they'd settled on Henry's couch. The same couch where they'd had so many conversations over the years, where Henry had fallen in love with Ryan slowly and then all at once. But this time there was no careful distance between them. Ryan had curled into Henry's side, his head resting on Henry's shoulder, and Henry had wrapped his arms around him like he'd wanted to do for years. "This feels right," Ryan had murmured against Henry's neck, his breath warm against Henry's skin. "It does," Henry had agreed, marveling at how perfectly Ryan fit against him, how natural it felt to hold him this way. They'd talked for hours that afternoon, sharing memories and fears and hopes for what might come next. Ryan had told Henry about the moment he'd realized his feelings, about the nights he'd lain awake thinking about Henry's laugh, about the way he'd started comparing every person he dated to Henry and finding them all lacking. Henry had shared his own journey, the slow recognition of his feelings, the pain of watching Ryan with other people, the way he'd become an expert at hiding his reactions and offering relationship advice when all he'd wanted was to tell Ryan to stop looking for love in other people and see what was right in front of him. As the afternoon had turned to evening, their conversation had grown more intimate, more charged. Ryan had started tracing patterns on Henry's arm as they talked, absent touches that sent shivers through Henry's entire body. Henry had found himself playing with Ryan's hair, something he'd never dared to do before, but which felt as natural as breathing now. "Henry," Ryan had said eventually, his voice soft and uncertain, "can I kiss you?" The question had hung in the air between them, loaded with years of unspoken longing and the promise of everything that might come after. Henry had cupped Ryan's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across Ryan's cheekbones, and had seen his own feelings reflected in Ryan's eyes. "Please," Henry had whispered. The kiss had been soft at first, tentative and questioning, both of them afraid of moving too fast or pushing too hard. But as the initial hesitation had melted away, it had deepened into something urgent and desperate, years of suppressed feelings finally finding expression. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Ryan had rested his forehead against Henry's. "Oh," he'd breathed, his eyes still closed. "Yeah," Henry had agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Oh." That was, Ryan had started, then trailed off, seeming unable to find words for what had just happened between them. "Perfect," Henry had finished for him. That was perfect. Ryan had opened his eyes then, and Henry had seen wonder there, and relief, and something that looked like coming home. "I love you," Ryan had said, the words simple and true, and everything Henry had waited years to hear. "I love you too," Henry had replied, and for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, he'd been able to say it without hiding, without fear, without reservation. They'd kissed again then, deeper and more certain, and Henry had felt like his entire world was reorganizing itself around this new reality. Ryan loved him. Ryan wanted him. All the careful distance he'd maintained, all the feelings he'd suppressed, all the dreams he'd told himself were impossible were suddenly, miraculously real. The rest of the evening had passed in a blur of conversation and gentle touches, of learning how to be with each other in this new way. They'd ordered takeout and eaten it curled together on the couch, Ryan's legs across Henry's lap, both of them marveling at the simple freedom of being able to touch each other without pretense. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Ryan had said at one point, his fingers intertwined with Henry's. "This feels too good to be real." "If it's a dream," Henry had replied, "I don't want to wake up." But it hadn't been a dream. It had been real, gloriously and terrifyingly real. And when Ryan had asked if he could stay the night, Henry had said yes without hesitation. They'd fallen asleep in Henry's bed, Ryan's head on Henry's chest, both of them fully clothed but closer than they had ever been before. The next morning had brought its own set of revelations and adjustments. Henry had woken first, his arms still around Ryan, and had spent several minutes just watching him sleep, marveling at the fact that he was allowed to do this now, that Ryan was his in a way he'd never dared to hope for. When Ryan had stirred awake, there had been a moment of confusion, of remembering where they were and what had happened between them. But then Ryan had smiled, that soft, sleepy smile that Henry loved, and had pressed a kiss to Henry's chest through his shirt. "Good morning," Ryan had murmured. "Good morning," Henry had replied, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. They'd lain there for a while, talking quietly about everything and nothing, about their fears and their hopes and the strange new territory they were navigating together. Ryan had been honest about his uncertainty, about the fact that he'd never been with a man before and wasn't sure what that meant for his identity or their relationship. "We don't have to figure it all out at once," Henry had said, stroking Ryan's hair. "We can take this as slow as you need to." "What if I'm not good at this?" Ryan had asked, vulnerability clear in his voice. "What if I don't know how to be what you need?" Henry had tilted Ryan's chin up so he could look into his eyes. "You're already what I need," he'd said firmly. "You've always been what I need. Everything else we'll figure out together." Over the following days, they'd begun the delicate process of transitioning from friends to something more. It had been awkward at times, both of them having to unlearn old patterns and establish new ones. They'd had to figure out how to tell their other friends, how to navigate the shift in their dynamic, how to be open about their relationship without losing the foundation of friendship that had made it possible in the first place. Some conversations had been easier than others. Their mutual friend Aaron Stewart had taken the news with a knowing smile and a comment about how it was about time. Other people had been more surprised, requiring more explanation and reassurance that this was real and serious and not just some experiment or a phase. Ryan had struggled the most with his family, particularly his parents, who had always assumed he would end up with a woman and give them grandchildren. The conversation with them had been difficult, full of questions and concerns, and a request for time to process and understand. But through it all, Henry had been there, offering support and patience and the steady reassurance that they would face whatever came together. And Ryan had done the same for him, showing up for every difficult conversation, every moment of doubt, every small victory along the way. 3 weeks after their first kiss, they'd settled into a rhythm that felt natural and right. Ryan had started staying over more often, leaving clothes in Henry's closet and toothbrush in Henry's bathroom. They'd had their first real fight about something stupid and inconsequential, and had worked through it with the kind of honest communication that Henry had never experienced in any of his previous relationships. They'd also had their first real conversation about the future, about what they wanted and what they were building together. Ryan had been clear that he was still figuring out his sexuality, still learning about himself and what it meant to be in love with a man. But he'd also been clear that his feelings for Henry weren't experimental or temporary, that this wasn't something he was trying on for size. "I know I don't have all the answers yet," Ryan had said one evening as they'd cooked dinner together in Henry's kitchen. "I know I'm still figuring out parts of myself that I never examined before. But I know that I love you, and I know that what I feel for you is real and deep and not going anywhere." Henry had pulled him close then, kissing him softly. "That's all I need to know," he'd said. "The rest we can figure out as we go." And they had been figuring it out day by day, conversation by conversation, kiss by kiss. Henry had learned the particular way Ryan liked his coffee in the morning, the sound he made when Henry kissed that spot just below his ear, the way his face lit up when Henry surprised him with small gestures of affection. Ryan had learned that Henry was more vulnerable than he appeared, that he needed reassurance sometimes that this was real and lasting, that he had a tendency to overthink things when he was stressed. He'd learned to read Henry's moods, to know when he needed space and when he needed comfort, to offer both without being asked. They'd also learned together, exploring the physical side of their relationship with patience and curiosity and a deep sense of trust. Every touch had been a revelation, every kiss a confirmation of the rightness of what they were building together. Now, sitting in that same coffee shop where everything had changed, Henry reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 3 months of learning to be together, of building something new on the foundation of their old friendship, of discovering that love could be both comfortable and exciting, both safe and transformative. Ryan reached across the table, taking Henry's hand in his, and Henry felt that same electricity he had felt the first time, amplified now by the knowledge of everything they'd shared and everything they were still discovering together. "I was thinking," Ryan said, his thumb tracing circles on Henry's palm, "about what you said that first night we talked about this, about feeling like you were drowning and flying at the same time." Henry nodded, remembering that conversation, how it had felt to finally articulate feelings he'd been carrying for so long. "I understand that now," Ryan continued. I understand what it feels like to love someone so much that it scares you, to want someone so completely that it changes everything about how you see the world. And how does it feel? Henry asked, squeezing Ryan's fingers. Like coming home, Ryan said simply. Like I spent years looking for something I didn't know I was missing, and then I found it in the last place I thought to look. Like everything that came before was just practice for loving you. Henry felt his chest tighten with emotion, overwhelmed as always by Ryan's ability to articulate feelings that Henry sometimes struggled to put into words. I love you, he said, the words carrying the weight of everything he felt but couldn't express. I love you too, Ryan replied, and I'm grateful every day that you waited for me to figure it out, that you didn't give up on the possibility of us even when it seemed impossible. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands linked across the table, both lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them here. The coffee shop bustled around them, but Henry felt like they were in their own private world, a space carved out just for them and the love they'd built together. I have something to tell you, Ryan said eventually, his voice taking on a slightly nervous quality that made Henry look up sharply. What is it? Henry asked, concern creeping into his voice. Ryan smiled, the nervousness giving way to excitement. It's good news, I promise. I've been thinking about what we talked about last week, about moving in together officially instead of just having me stay over all the time. Henry's heart started beating faster. And I want to do it, Ryan said, his eyes bright with anticipation. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just stolen moments between other obligations. Henry felt a surge of joy so intense it was almost overwhelming. Are you sure, he asked, needing to hear it again, needing to be certain that Ryan had thought this through completely. I'm sure, Ryan said firmly. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Henry. I love the life we're building together, and I want to make it official. I want to stop pretending that this is temporary or casual or anything other than the most important relationship I've ever had. Henry brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to Ryan's knuckles. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, I want that too. I want all of it. With you. Ryan's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. Really, really, Henry confirmed. I've wanted that since the first night you stayed over. Since the first morning I woke up with you in my arms. I want to build a home with you, a real home that belongs to both of us. They spent the rest of their time in the coffee shop making plans, talking about practical things like lease agreements and furniture and how to merge their belongings. But underneath the logistics, Henry could feel the deeper significance of what they were committing to, the way this decision represented a new level of trust and investment in their future together. When they finally left the coffee shop, they walked hand in hand through the city streets, pointing out apartments with for rent signs, imagining what their shared space might look like. Ryan had strong opinions about natural light and kitchen counter space, while Henry cared more about having a good reading nook and enough room for both of their book collections. We're going to need a bigger bookshelf, Ryan said, laughing as they passed a used bookstore, and Henry slowed down automatically. We're going to need several bigger bookshelves, Henry corrected, pulling Ryan closer as they walked, and a bigger couch for reading together. And a bigger bed, Ryan added, his voice dropping slightly in a way that made Henry's skin tingle. Definitely a bigger bed, Henry agreed, stopping to kiss Ryan right there on the sidewalk, not caring who might see or what anyone might think. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ryan rested his forehead against Henry's. I can't wait to start this next chapter with you, he said softly. Me neither, Henry replied, meaning it completely. They made their way back to Henry's apartment, both excited and slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision they just made. Moving in together felt like a natural progression, but it also represented a level of commitment that neither of them had experienced before in a relationship. Once they were home, they spent the evening looking at apartment listings online, debating the merits of different neighborhoods and floor plans. Ryan had a practical streak that Henry found endearing, carefully calculating commute times and grocery store proximity, while Henry was more focused on aesthetic considerations like hardwood floors and crown molding. What about this one? Ryan said, turning his laptop screen toward Henry. It's got 2 bedrooms, so we could have a home office. And look at that kitchen. Henry studied the listing, noting the large windows and exposed brick walls. It's beautiful, he said, and it's in that neighborhood you liked when we walked through it last month. Should we schedule a viewing? Ryan asked, his excitement evident in his voice. Absolutely, Henry said, leaning over to kiss Ryan's temple. I love seeing you this excited about our future. Ryan turned to face him fully, closing the laptop and setting it aside. I am excited, he said. I'm excited about everything we're building together. 6 months ago, I never could have imagined that I'd be here, planning a life with you, feeling this happy and settled and sure about what I want. What changed? Henry asked, even though he thought he knew the answer. You, Ryan said simply, you changed at everything. You showed me what it felt like to be truly known and accepted and loved for exactly who I am. You made me realize that all those other relationships felt wrong because I was trying to force myself into a shape that didn't fit, trying to want things I didn't actually want. Henry felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in Ryan's voice. You did the same for me, he said. You made me realize that love doesn't have to be painful or one-sided or hopeless. You showed me what it feels like to be chosen, to be someone's first choice instead of their backup plan. Ryan cupped Henry's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. We chose each other, he said firmly. And I choose you every day, in every moment, in every decision I make about our future. They made love that night with a tenderness and intensity that left them both shaking, holding each other close afterward and whispering promises about the life they were going to build together. Henry fell asleep with Ryan's head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and marveling at the fact that this was his life now, that he got to have this every night for as long as they both wanted it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of apartment hunting and planning. They found a place they both loved, a 1 bedroom with huge windows and a kitchen island perfect for cooking together. The lease signing felt ceremonial, both of them grinning as they wrote their names side by side on the paperwork. Moving day was chaotic but joyful, with Aaron and a few other friends helping them transport boxes and furniture. Henry watched Ryan direct the placement of their couch and felt a deep sense of satisfaction at the way Ryan said our couch, our coffee table, our home. That first night in their new apartment, they ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes, too tired to unpack properly, but too excited to sleep. Ryan had found a bottle of wine somewhere in the chaos, and they'd shared it while making lists of everything they needed to buy and do to make the space truly theirs. This feels surreal, Ryan said, leaning back against the wall and looking around at their new living room. Good surreal, but surreal. I know what you mean, Henry replied, settling beside him and taking his hand. 6 months ago, I never would have imagined this. I was so convinced that you'd never see me as anything more than a friend. Ryan squeezed his fingers. I'm sorry it took me so long to get here, he said. I'm sorry you had to wait for me to figure myself out. Don't apologize, Henry said firmly. You got here when you were ready to get here. And honestly, I think the waiting made this even more precious. I don't take any of it for granted. They spent their first few weeks in the new apartment establishing routines and traditions. Saturday morning coffee in bed became sacred, as did their evening walks around the neighborhood and their Sunday afternoon cooking experiments. Henry learned that Ryan was surprisingly domestic, taking pleasure in organizing their shared closet and arranging their books by a complicated system that made sense only to him. Ryan discovered that Henry was more sentimental than he'd realized, keeping ticket stubs from their first official date and pressing flowers from the bouquet Ryan had brought him when they'd signed their lease. He'd find these little mementos tucked into books and drawers, physical evidence of Henry's desire to preserve every moment of their relationship. Their first fight in the new apartment had been about dishes of all things. Ryan had a tendency to leave coffee cups around the apartment, while Henry preferred to clean as he went. It had escalated into a larger conversation about expectations and communication, but they'd worked through it with the kind of honest dialogue that Henry had never experienced in previous relationships. I think I'm still learning how to be in a partnership, Ryan had admitted afterward, as they'd sat on their couch working out a system that would work for both of them. I spent so long in relationships where I felt like I had to be someone else that I'm still figuring out how to be myself while also being considerate of what you need. We're both learning, Henry had replied. I've never lived with someone I was in love with before. I've never had to figure out how to share space with someone whose opinion matters this much to me. They'd kissed and made up, and the next morning Henry had found a note from Ryan next to the coffee maker apologizing for the cups and promising to be more mindful. It had been such a small gesture, but it had meant everything to Henry, evidence that Ryan was committed to growing and changing for the sake of their relationship. 3 months into living together, they'd hosted their first dinner party, inviting Aaron and a few other friends to see their new place. Henry had been nervous about it, worried about what their friends would think of their domestic setup, but Ryan had been excited to show off their home and their relationship. The evening had gone perfectly, their friends clearly delighted by how happy and settled they both seemed. Aaron had pulled Henry aside at one point to tell him how good it was to see him this content, how obvious it was that he and Ryan were meant to be together. You two have something special, Aaron had said. I've known you both for years, and I've never seen either of you this happy in a relationship. Henry had looked across the room at Ryan, who was laughing at something one of their friends had said, his face bright with joy and contentment. I know, Henry had replied. I feel like the luckiest person in the world. As winter had turned to spring, their relationship had deepened and settled into something that felt both exciting and secure. They'd weathered their first major illness together when Henry had come down with the flu, Ryan taking care of him with a tenderness that had made Henry fall in love with him all over again. They'd celebrated their first Valentine's Day as a couple, Ryan surprising Henry with a weekend trip to a cabin upstate, where they'd spent 2 days hiking and reading and making love by the fireplace. They'd also had their first serious conversation about the future, about what they wanted in terms of career goals and family, and the kind of life they were building together. Ryan had been clear that he wanted children someday, and Henry had felt a surge of joy at the thought of raising a family with him. They talked about adoption and surrogacy, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, and the values they wanted to instill in their children. I want to build something lasting with you, Ryan had said one evening as they'd walked through their neighborhood, pointing out houses they liked and imagining what their lives might look like in 5 or 10 years. I want that too, Henry had replied. I want to grow old with you, to build a life that's bigger than just the two of us but still centered on what we have together. Now, 6 months after moving in together and nearly a year since their first confession in the coffee shop, Henry reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They were planning a small celebration for their 1-year anniversary, nothing elaborate but something to mark the significance of what they'd built together. Ryan had been secretive about his plans for the evening, insisting that he wanted to surprise Henry with something special. Henry had tried to guess what it might be, but Ryan had remained stubbornly tight-lipped, only smiling and telling him to trust the process. The morning of their anniversary, Henry had woken up to find Ryan already gone, a note on his pillow saying that he'd be back in a few hours and that Henry should be ready to go out by 7 o'clock. Henry had spent the day in a state of pleasant anticipation, wondering what Ryan had planned and feeling grateful for the love and creativity his boyfriend brought to their relationship. When Ryan returned home that afternoon, he was carrying a garment bag and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. He'd kissed Henry thoroughly before disappearing into their bedroom to get ready, leaving Henry to wonder what kind of evening required such elaborate preparation. At exactly 7 o'clock, Ryan had emerged from the bedroom, wearing the dark blue suit that Henry loved on him, his hair styled and his eyes bright with anticipation. You look incredible, he'd said, taking in Henry's own carefully chosen outfit. So do you, Henry had replied, meaning it completely. Ryan had always been handsome, but there was something about the way he carried himself now. The confidence and contentment that came from being truly happy that made him absolutely radiant. Ready? Ryan had asked, offering Henry his arm. They'd taken a cab to the other side of the city, to a neighborhood Henry didn't recognize. When they'd stopped in front of an elegant restaurant that Henry had heard of but never been to, he'd looked at Ryan in surprise. Ryan, this place is incredibly expensive, he'd said. It's our anniversary, Ryan had replied, his smile soft and warm. I wanted to do something special, something worthy of what we're celebrating. The dinner had been perfect, course after course of beautifully prepared food accompanied by wine that Ryan had clearly researched carefully. They talked about their first year together, sharing favorite memories and moments that had been particularly meaningful to each of them. Henry had been surprised by some of Ryan's choices, moments he hadn't realized had been significant to Ryan at the time. The first morning they'd woken up in their new apartment, when Henry had made coffee and brought it to Ryan in bed. The evening they'd assembled their bookshelf together, working side by side and arguing good-naturedly about the best way to organize their combined collection. The night Henry had gotten food poisoning and Ryan had stayed up with him, rubbing his back and bringing him water and making him feel cared for even when he was miserable. "Those are the moments I think about when I think about us," Ryan had said, reaching across the table to take Henry's hand. "Not just the big romantic gestures, but the everyday ways we take care of each other." Henry had felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I think about those moments too," he'd said. "I think about how natural it feels to build a life with you. How easy it is to love you then when you're being stubborn about the proper way to load the dishwasher." Ryan had laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "I'm not stubborn about the dishwasher," he protested. "I just have a system that maximizes efficiency." "You're incredibly stubborn about the dishwasher," Henry had said fondly, "and about the thermostat, and about the correct way to fold fitted sheets, and about approximately a dozen other domestic issues. But you love me anyway," Ryan had said, his voice taking on a slightly more serious tone. "I love you because of those things, not in spite of them," Henry had corrected. "I love your systems and your stubbornness and your need to optimize everything. I love the way you care about details, the way you want our life together to be as good as it can possibly be." Ryan had brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to Henry's knuckles. "I have something for you," he'd said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Henry's heart had started beating faster, wondering what kind of gift required this level of ceremony. Ryan had pulled out a small wrapped box, setting it on the table between them with hands that shook slightly. "Ryan," Henry had started, but Ryan had shaken his head. "Let me say something first," Ryan had said, his voice serious but warm. "This year with you has been the best year of my life. Not just because I fell in love, but because I fell in love with my best friend, with someone who knew me completely and loved me anyway. You've seen me at my worst and my most confused, and you never made me feel like I had to be anyone other than exactly who I am." Henry had felt tears starting in his eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in Ryan's voice. "I know we've talked about the future, about what we want to build together," Ryan had continued, "but I wanted to give you something that represents how serious I am about those plans, how committed I am to making them real." Henry had picked up the box with trembling hands, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, nestled in soft velvet, had been a simple silver band. Elegant and understated and perfect. It's a promise ring," Ryan had explained, his voice soft. "A promise that I'm in this for the long haul, that I want to build a life with you that lasts. I know we're not ready for engagement yet, but I wanted you to have something that represents my commitment to you, to us." Henry had stared at the ring, overwhelmed by the gesture and everything it represented. "Ryan," he'd whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you wear it?" Ryan had asked, vulnerability clear in his voice. "Will you let me promise you that this is real and lasting and everything I want for my future?" Henry had nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Ryan had taken the ring from the band and slipped it onto Henry's right hand, the metal warm from Ryan's touch. "I love you," Ryan had said, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love the life we built together, and I can't wait to see what comes next." "I love you too," Henry had managed, his voice breaking slightly. "This is perfect. You're perfect. Everything about this is perfect." They'd kissed across the table, both crying a little, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were promising each other. The other diners had probably thought they were witnessing an engagement, and in a way they were. Not a legal engagement, but an emotional one, a commitment to continue building something beautiful and lasting together. The rest of the evening had passed in a haze of joy and emotion. They'd walked through the city holding hands, Henry's new ring catching the light from the street lamps, both of them talking about their dreams for the future and the plans they wanted to make together. When they'd finally made it home, they'd made love with a tenderness and intensity that left them both shaking, holding each other close afterward and whispering promises about the years to come. Now, 3 months later, Henry twisted the ring on his finger as he sat in their coffee shop, waiting for Ryan to return from the counter with their usual orders. It had become a habit, this unconscious gesture when he was thinking about their relationship, about how far they'd come and how grateful he was for every day they had together. Ryan slid into the seat across from him, setting down Henry's latte and keeping his own black coffee. "You're doing the ring thing again," he said, his voice warm with affection. "The ring thing," Henry repeated, smiling. "You twist it when you're thinking about us," Ryan explained. "You did it on our anniversary when you were giving your speech about how much you love my domestic stubbornness." Henry looked down at his hand, realizing Ryan was right. "I didn't know I did that," he said. "I love that you do it," Ryan said, reaching across to still Henry's hand with his own. "I love that wearing my promise means enough to you that you touch it when you're feeling emotional about us." Henry turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers. "It does mean everything to me," he said. "Not just the ring, but what it represents. The fact that you wanted to make that kind of promise. That you see a future with me that's worth promising." Ryan squeezed his fingers. "I see a future with you that's worth everything," he said simply. "Worth changing my entire understanding of myself. Worth disappointing people who had different expectations for my life. Worth figuring out how to be the kind of partner you deserve." "You already are the kind of partner I deserve," Henry said firmly. "You're the kind of partner I never dared to hope for." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this point. The coffee shop bustled around them, but Henry felt like they were in their own private world, a space carved out just for them and the love they'd built together. "I have news," Ryan said eventually, his voice taking on an excited quality that made Henry look up sharply. "Good news?" Henry asked. "Very good news," Ryan confirmed, his eyes bright. "I got the promotion." Henry felt a surge of joy and pride. "Ryan, that's incredible," he said, squeezing Ryan's hand. "I'm so proud of you." Ryan had been working toward this promotion for months, putting in extra hours and taking on additional responsibilities. Henry had watched him stress over presentations and worry about whether his hard work would be recognized, offering support and encouragement throughout the process. "Thank you," Ryan said, his smile radiant. "I couldn't have done it without your support, without knowing I had someone at home who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself." "You did this," Henry said firmly. "Your talent and your hard work and your dedication. I just got to watch you be amazing." Ryan brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to Henry's knuckles. "I want to celebrate," he said. "I want to take you somewhere special and toast to this new chapter." "Where did you have in mind?" Henry asked, already excited by the prospect of celebrating Ryan's success. "That new place downtown that just opened? The one with the rooftop bar," Ryan said. "I made reservations for tomorrow night." Henry felt a flutter of anticipation. "That sounds perfect," he said. "I love seeing you this excited about your career. I'm excited about everything," Ryan said, his voice warm. "My job, our life together, the plans we're making for the future. I feel like everything is falling into place in the best possible way." Henry felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. "It really is," he agreed. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself to make sure this is all real." "It's real," Ryan said softly. "We're real, this is real, and it's only getting to get better." They finished their coffee and made their way home, both excited about Ryan's promotion and the celebration they were planning. That evening, they'd cooked dinner together and talked about what the promotion might mean for Ryan's career trajectory, about the new opportunities it might open up, and the ways it might affect their shared goals. Henry had watched Ryan talk about his work with passion and enthusiasm, and had felt a deep sense of pride in the man he'd chosen to build a life with. Ryan had grown so much over the past year and a half, becoming more confident and self-assured, more willing to advocate for himself and pursue what he wanted. The next evening, they dressed up and gone to the rooftop bar, toasting Ryan's success with champagne and watching the city lights twinkle below them. Ryan had been glowing with happiness and pride, and Henry had felt lucky to be the person he'd chosen to share this moment with. "I keep thinking about that conversation we had early on," Ryan said as they stood at the edge of the rooftop, looking out over the city, "about how I felt like I was living someone else's life. making choices because they were expected rather than because they were what I wanted. And now, Henry prompted, wrapping his arms around Ryan from behind. Now I feel like I'm living exactly the life I want, Ryan said, leaning back against Henry's chest. The career I want, the relationship I want, the future I want, everything feels authentic and chosen and right. Henry pressed a kiss to Ryan's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. I'm so proud of you, he murmured. Not just for the promotion, but for the courage it took to build this life, to choose what you wanted even when it was scary and uncertain. I couldn't have done it without you, Ryan said, turning in Henry's arms to face him. You gave me the safety to explore who I really was, the confidence to pursue what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I should want. We gave each other that, Henry corrected gently. You did the same for me. Showed me what it felt like to be truly loved and chosen and valued. They'd kiss there on the rooftop, surrounded by the lights of the city and the promise of everything still to come. Henry had felt like they were on top of the world, literally and figuratively, celebrating not just Ryan's professional success, but the life they'd built together in the future they were planning. 6 months later, they were back in their original coffee shop, the place where everything had changed between them. But this time they weren't sitting across from each other in nervous anticipation. They were side by side in their usual booth, Ryan's arm around Henry's shoulders, both of them relaxed and content. They'd made this coffee shop a regular part of their routine, coming here every few weeks to catch up and reconnect away from the distractions of home and work. It had become a kind of ritual, a way of honoring the significance of this place in their relationship while also creating new memories together. I was thinking, Ryan said, his fingers playing with the hair at the nape of Henry's neck, about that first conversation we had here, when I told you I couldn't stop thinking about you. Henry smiled, remembering the terror and hope of that moment. You were so nervous, he said. I thought you were going to bolt at any second. I almost did, Ryan admitted. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I came in, trying to work up the courage to actually say what I needed to say. I'm glad you found it, Henry said, settling more comfortably against Ryan's side. I'm glad you were brave enough to tell me the truth. Best decision I ever made, Ryan said, pressing a kiss to the top of Henry's head. Scariest decision, but definitely the best. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the familiar rhythm of the coffee shop around them. Henry recognized some of the regular customers, people who'd been here during their dramatic confession nearly 2 years ago, people who had no idea they'd witnessed the beginning of something beautiful. Henry, Ryan said eventually, his voice taking on a slightly nervous quality that made Henry look up at him. What is it? Henry asked, noting the way Ryan's hand had stilled in his hair. I have something I want to ask you, Ryan said, his eyes bright with an emotion Henry couldn't quite identify. Henry felt his heart start to beat faster, something in Ryan's tone suggesting this was more than just a casual question. Okay, he said. Ryan shifted slightly, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. Henry's breath caught, his eyes widening as he realized what was happening. Henry Bailey, Ryan said, his voice steady despite the emotion clear in his expression. Will you marry me? The question hung in the air between them, perfect and terrifying, and everything Henry had dreamed of but never dared to expect. He stared at the ring box, then at Ryan's face, seeing love and hope and absolute certainty there. Ryan, Henry breathed, his voice barely audible. I know we said we weren't ready for this yet, Ryan continued, his words coming faster now. But I've been thinking about it for months, and I realized that I'm not waiting because I'm not ready. I'm waiting because I thought I was supposed to wait, because there's some timeline I'm supposed to follow. But the truth is, I've never been more sure of anything in my life than I am of wanting to spend the rest of my life with you. Henry felt tears starting in his eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in Ryan's voice and the magnitude of what he was asking. I want to marry you, Ryan said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring that was perfect in every way. I want to make it official, make it legal, make it permanent. I want to stand in front of everyone we love and promise to choose you every day for the rest of our lives. Henry looked at the ring, then back at Ryan's face, seeing his entire future reflected in Ryan's eyes. Yes, he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. Yes, Ryan repeated, his own voice shaky with relief and joy. Yes. Henry said again, louder this time, laughing through his tears. Of course, yes, absolutely yes. Ryan slipped the ring onto Henry's finger, his hands trembling slightly with emotion. It fit perfectly, catching the light from the coffee shop's windows and sparkling like a promise made real. I love you, Ryan said, cupping Henry's face in his hands. I love you so much, and I can't wait to be your husband. I love you too, Henry replied, his voice thick with tears and joy. I can't believe this is real, that you're really asking me to marry you. It's real, Ryan said, kissing him softly. We're real, this is real, and it's going to be the most beautiful wedding anyone has ever seen. Henry laughed, kissing Ryan back with all the love and joy and gratitude he felt. Around them, the coffee shop continued its normal rhythm, but Henry felt like the entire world had shifted, like everything was suddenly brighter and more beautiful than it had ever been before. They spent the next hour making plans, talking about venues and guest lists and the kind of ceremony they wanted to have. Ryan had clearly been thinking about this for a while, having already researched photographers and florists and all the details that would make their wedding perfect. I want it to be small, Henry said, his new engagement ring catching the light as he gestured. Just our closest friends and family, somewhere meaningful to us. What about the park where we had our first official date? Ryan suggested. We could have the ceremony there and then dinner at that restaurant we love. Henry felt his chest tighten with emotion at the thoughtfulness of the suggestion. That's perfect, he said. Everything about this is perfect. They called their families and closest friends from the coffee shop, sharing their news and basking in the excitement and congratulations that poured in. Aaron had screamed so loudly that other customers had turned to stare, and Ryan's parents had cried with joy when they heard the news. As the afternoon turned to evening, they finally made their way home, both giddy with excitement in the surreal nature of being engaged. Henry kept looking at his ring, marveling at how right it felt to wear it, how perfectly it symbolized everything they'd built together. That night, they'd made love with a tenderness and intensity that left them both shaking, holding each other close afterward and whispering about the life they were going to build as husbands. I can't wait to marry you, Ryan had said, his lips against Henry's neck. I can't wait either, Henry had replied, running his fingers through Ryan's hair. I can't wait to call you my husband, to build a family with you, to grow old with you. Now, 8 months later, Henry stood in front of a mirror in the small room at the back of the park's community center, adjusting his tie for the 10th time and trying to calm his nerves. In 30 minutes, he would walk down the aisle and marry the love of his life, the man who had changed everything about how he understood love in partnership and happiness. Aaron appeared in the mirror behind him, resplendent in his role as best man. You look perfect, he said, straightening Henry's boutonniere. Stop fidgeting. I can't help it, Henry said, his hand shaking slightly. I'm about to marry Ryan. I'm about to marry the man I've been in love with for over 3 years, and he's about to marry you, Aaron reminded him gently. The man who waited for him to figure himself out, who loved him through every moment of confusion and growth, who built the most beautiful relationship I've ever seen. Henry took a deep breath, feeling some of his nervousness settle. You're right, he said. This is the best day of my life. It absolutely is, Aaron agreed. Now come on, it's time. They made their way to the ceremony site, a small clearing in the park where they'd set up chairs for their 50 closest friends and family members. The autumn leaves created a canopy of gold and red above them, and the late afternoon light filtered through the trees in a way that made everything look magical. Henry took his place at the front, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited for Ryan to appear. The string quartet they'd hired began playing, and Henry felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as the familiar melody filled the air. And then Ryan was there, walking down the aisle with his parents, looking absolutely radiant in his dark gray suit. His eyes found Henry's immediately, and his face broke into the most beautiful smile Henry had ever seen. Henry felt like his heart might burst from the sheer joy of this moment, of seeing Ryan walking toward him with such love and certainty in his expression. This was really happening. They were really doing this, making it official, promising to love each other for the rest of their lives. When Ryan reached the front, his father shook Henry's hand and his mother kissed his cheek, both of them welcoming him into their family with warmth and genuine affection. Then Ryan was standing beside him, taking his hands and looking into his eyes with such love that Henry felt like he might float away. The ceremony was perfect, exactly what they'd envisioned. They'd written their own vows, promises that were deeply personal and specific to their journey together. Ryan had talked about the courage it took to love someone so completely, about the way Henry had shown him what it meant to be truly known and accepted. Henry had spoken about patience and hope, about the way Ryan had taught him that love could be both safe and exciting, both comfortable and transformative. When the officiant pronounced them married, when they kissed for the first time as husbands, Henry felt like his entire world reorganized itself around this new reality. They were married. They were husbands. They had promised to love each other forever, and everyone they cared about had witnessed that promise. The reception had been everything they dreamed of, full of laughter and dancing and heartfelt toasts from their friends and family. Henry's parents had welcomed Ryan with open arms, and Ryan's family had done the same for Henry. It felt like the joining of not just two lives, but two families, two groups of people who loved them and wanted to see them happy. As the evening wound down, as their guests began to drift away with hugs and congratulations, Henry and Ryan found themselves alone for a moment on the dance floor. The DJ was playing their song, the one that had been playing in the background during their first kiss, and they swayed together in the dim light, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd just done. "How does it feel to be married?" Ryan asked, his voice soft against Henry's ear. "Perfect," Henry replied, meaning it completely. "Like everything I've ever wanted just became real." Ryan pulled back to look at him, his eyes bright with tears and joy. "I love you, husband," he said, testing out the word. "I love you too, husband," Henry replied, marveling at how right the words sounded, how perfectly it captured what they were to each other now. They danced until the very last song, holding each other close and talking quietly about the honeymoon they were leaving for in the morning, about the life they were going to build as married men, about all the adventures and challenges and joys that lay ahead of them. When they finally made it home to their apartment, now officially shared by two husbands instead of two boyfriends, they made love with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their bed, their wedding rings catching the moonlight from the window. "I can't believe we did it," Ryan said, his voice sleepy and content. "I can't believe we're actually married." "I can," Henry said, pressing a kiss to Ryan's forehead. "This was always where we were headed, from the moment you told me you couldn't stop thinking about me. We just had to be brave enough to get here." Ryan smiled, settling more comfortably against Henry's chest. "I'm so glad we were brave," he said. "I'm so glad we figured it out." "Me too," Henry agreed, running his fingers through Ryan's hair. "Me too." As they drifted off to sleep, Henry reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From friends to lovers to partners to husbands, they had built something beautiful and lasting and real. They had chosen each other every day through confusion and growth and change, and now they had promised to keep choosing each other for the rest of their lives. The future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. There would be challenges, Henry knew, moments of difficulty and uncertainty and growth, but they would face them together as partners and husbands and best friends who had learned how to love each other completely. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, Henry thought as sleep began to claim him. Sometimes the person you're meant to spend your life with is the one who's been right in front of you all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to see them clearly. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that person sees you just as clearly and loves you just as much. And you get to build a life together that's more beautiful than anything you ever dared to dream. Henry fell asleep with Ryan's ring pressing against his chest, where their hands were intertwined, with the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged, with the man he was meant to love for the rest of his life. Tomorrow would bring new adventures and challenges, but tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect. They were home.